Hello everyone and welcome back to this week's last segment of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. And this is kind of a carryover segment from when we were talking about strength of schedules earlier in the week and how big those are in interpreting your fantasy football picks. And to close out the week, I thought let's revisit that. Let's look at the biggest losers in terms of the wide receiver market. Because these three guys that I have on this list, they're certainly not the biggest guys, and they're certainly not on teams that you expect to really get a lot of production out of their wide receivers. They are on teams that are much worse off. So, I think that these aren't necessarily guys who will be looking at as fantastic options for you, but they're still options that kind of got the short end of the stick. And so, without further ado, let's jump right into them. Now, when I think about the wide receiver market, right? Like I said before, it's a lot of superstars, and then after that, you're kind of throwing darts at a board, picking guys at will. And so, trying to parse through so many different wide receivers, I think it's made much easier understanding their strength of schedule and understanding who they'll be playing and how they match up in terms of these games. And so, while like I said, these three guys certainly aren't going to be, guys who are going to be talked about a lot. They do kind of fit into the conversation of people you might be looking at after you pick your wide receiver one, maybe even as a flex option. So this segment isn't necessarily meant to dissuade you, but it's meant to give it perspective as to how you interpret the wide receiver market. So let's just jump right into it. Let's start off with a guy who not only has to play in the AFC North, but now faces a ton of confusion as to who his quarterback is going to be, in George Pickens. Obviously, playing in the AFC North does not help, but he has the second toughest schedule amongst all wide receivers in terms of that department. And like I talked about yesterday with evaluating what to make of this Wilson-Fields QB battle for Pittsburgh, I really think that could factor into what people think about George Pickens. Because even though he has a tough schedule, I really think whoever wins that QB battle is going to tell a lot of the story of how George Pickens is going to be seen in Pittsburgh. Not just this season, but for the immediate future. Because, say Russell Wilson wins the QB battle, I actually think that would be more beneficial to George Pickens right now than Justin Fields winning the battle. Because if Justin Fields won the battle, you get a lot more RPOs. Perhaps Pickens' target share goes down. But if you get Russell Wilson, he's a fantastic deep ball thrower, like I said, who can really get the ball to Pickens, really use his verticality. And that's something that Pittsburgh hasn't necessarily had in terms of their offensive system. They haven't really had a guy ultimately focused on getting the ball downfield. Yes, they've had a lot of mobile QBs, and it would be exciting for Justin Fields to win the starting job because of the future of the franchise being considered here and the fact that ultimately, at the end of the day, he does present a better future than Russell Wilson. But this is the present. You need someone who can really open up the offense, and I think that Russell Wilson can do that. And should he be the starter, I think George Pickens can be a sneaky option regardless of schedule. I think the Steelers are getting a little bit underestimated, but I kind of feel like it's fair a little bit, because we don't really know how to evaluate them until this whole QB battle is finished. And so, while I will be a lot higher on them if Russ wins the starting job, I wouldn't necessarily be mad if Justin Fields starts the job. Just know that George Pickens would look a lot less of a sexy option if it's Justin Fields. Then we look at another receiver who I actually expect to get a lot more targets, but I don't necessarily like his style of play within the system that he's in. That's Christian Kirk of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now, the Jags do need a lot of their wide receivers to step up because they're placing a lot of emphasis on Brian Thomas being the top guy. I really like Brian Thomas, and I like what he brings to this team, the verticality that Trevor Lawrence hasn't had. he brings a lot of explosiveness. But that's really all that the Jacksonville Jaguars kind of skill position groups seem to be predicated on. Speed, speed, speed. The only player who I really like is a solid route runner who can actually get open is Evan Engram, which is funny to say. And that's why Christian Kirk is someone who I think needs to step up and be a well-rounded receiver to help this transition for the Jacksonville Jaguars at the wide receiver position. But his schedule, bottom 6, I don't necessarily think that the Jags in the AFC South are that far out of the division race. But it's something to keep an eye on. Because the AFC South is going to be one of those divisions where you're going to have a lot of shootouts, a lot of games kind of predicated on putting up points early and often. When I look at the offenses and the systems in the AFC South, I look at the Texans. They're all set at wide receiver. They're all set at quarterback. When I look at the Colts, yeah, Anthony Richardson is a huge maybe in terms of what he can be. But just looking at that group, I think it has a lot of potential. And Tennessee as well. I really like Tennessee as a team that's going to sneak up on everybody. And when I look at the Jags' skill position core, I don't see anyone as a standout. The Texans, they have a 3-headed monster. Last year, Nico Collins, Tank Dell, Noah Brown. They add Stephon Diggs. Tennessee adds Calvin Ridley and DeAndre Hopkins. The Colts, we talked about them a lot. While they definitely don't have good skill position talent, Michael Pittman, I think he's going to steadily improve. I like Josh Downs, and I like Alec Pierce as a deep threat. They drafted A.D. Mitchell. All of these teams in the AFC South are making moves at the wide receiver position, and they're really transcending what Jacksonville has to offer. Yeah, they got Gabe Davis. Yeah, they got Brian Thomas. But is that really what you want? Is that really what you're presenting to Trevor Lawrence as the receiving group? And I'm not saying I don't like these guys. But at the end of the day, when I look at this wide receiver room, I just see one trait and one trait only: speed. You need guys to get open. You need guys to run routes. You need variety in your offense. And right now I don't see the variety in the Jacksonville Jaguars offense. And I don't see the variety that Christian Kirk presents. And so I think that Christian Kirk is definitely someone I wouldn't even consider drafting or streaming. Because in that system, I don't necessarily think that there's going to be someone who separates themselves from the pack as someone who can run routes. Maybe Brian Thomas does that. Maybe he gets more varied. But I just view him as an explosive guy that they wanted to add to get verticality. And it's good that you want that out of Trevor Lawrence, but the reason Trevor Lawrence is stagnating is because a lot of these guys can't necessarily get open downfield outside of Evan Engram. And when Trevor Lawrence hones in on just one guy getting open, that says a lot about his confidence and where it's at right now. If you're going to invest money in Trevor Lawrence, you better invest money in that wide receiver room. And so I can't necessarily see Christian Kirk winning at anything. And I think that, unfortunately, he deserves to be on this list. And then we look at a guy who, yeah, man, I think his stock rapidly dropped after Russell Wilson left town. And that ride finished. And Courtland Sutton, with the 6th toughest schedule, and to top it all off, breaking in Bo Nix. Like I said, gone to Russell Wilson, who really did kind of find the connection with him in the latter stages of his career in Denver. But now that he's gone, I don't necessarily see a pathway where Bo Nix is suddenly going to become a revelation for Courtland Sutton. I really like Courtland Sutton as a deep ball threat, but the fact that we don't necessarily know if Bo Nix is going to be a guy who is just a Sean Payton project or is immediately going to be like one of the stars of the league, I don't necessarily think Courtland Sutton has helped in any way. It's a shame because Sean Payton should see that he shouldn't build around Bo Nix as a guy. He should build around Courtland Sutton as the guy. He should build around Javonte Williams as a guy. I think that this move for Bo Nix is going to be judged upon whether or not he can make Courtland Sutton happy. Because if Courtland Sutton isn't happy, I expect him to get up out of there. And he deserves better, Courtland Sutton. And so we're going to have to see how that season plays out for the Broncos, but it could be a much rockier ride than when Russell Wilson promised the ride. But at the end of the day, when I look at these three guys, they're kind of in that second or third tier of wide receiver where you really are picking them more as flyers, hoping that they're going to be big stars. But at the end of the day, you don't necessarily trust them. Out of all of them, I don't really trust Kirk. I think Pickens can succeed. We're going to have to see with Sutton. But I feel like this list is appropriate for where they are in terms of strength of schedule and where they are in terms of their divisions. But that should just about do it for the show and this week. Thank you guys for tuning in all week. I've been Christopher Shepard. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. Like, follow, and subscribe to this show and the network. Consider leaving a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. It's a huge support to all concerned. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in. We'll be back better than ever next week on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.